It's not very often that we see movie scores composed by jazz musicians, but it's even less often that we see movie scores by jazz musicians that were improvised. And perhaps only once did we see a jazz musician improvise a movie score in one night. Well, in 1958, that is exactly what Miles Davis did on a French crime thriller called Elevator to the Gallows. And before we jump into this, I just want to remind you that everything on the Cornell Music Academy is currently 30% off with the code MUSICTHEORY30. More about that in a little bit. Elevator to the Gallows is a French crime thriller that helped pave the way for the French New Wave in 1958. It was directed by Louis this guy, which I'm not even going to try to attempt the correct French pronunciation of that. And the IMDb plot summary goes like this. A self-assured businessman murders his employer, who also happens to be the husband of his mistress, which unintentionally provokes an ill-fated chain of events. Wow, let's dig into some of the music from this. Okay, this is super interesting already. So this is a crime thriller, right? And without having seen the film, you can kind of imagine, what a 58 crime thriller might be. Now, of course, talking about crime thriller, one could kind of make the connection to maybe the spy thriller type of genre. Maybe James Bond, which incidentally did not come out until 1962, 4 years after this film. However, check this out. We kind of have this little vamp set up in the beginning here. And there's a little more to it than that, but you see what's going on here. We're starting to approach. Four years before James Bond happens. It's interesting because, when we've talked about the James Bond music in the past, we've kind of talked about, well, is it naturally the type of sound that just lends itself very well to being mysterious and spy-worthy or crime thriller-worthy? Or is it simply that these are the films that have always been connected with that type of music? Personally, I kind of think it's probably a little bit of both. But it's fascinating to hear not exactly the sound of James Bond, but starting to kind of get into that territory 4 years before James Bond even happened. What's interesting here is you can kind of see, just even on the plot summary alone, this guy kills his employer and he's with that guy's wife. This is kind of exactly the sound you'd expect, kind of smooth and mysterious, It really fits the description quite well. And there's actually a really interesting story behind how this all happened. I mean, you gotta wonder, how did somebody wind up getting Miles Davis in 1958 when he was doing huge things and get him to improvise a movie score in one night? Well, the director of the film had been a jazz fan since his early teens. And right at this time, he had been listening to a lot of Miles's work, and it just so happened that as he was editing the film, Miles came to Paris to play. He had a connection through a friend who's actually able to meet Miles. And it was then that he tried to convince Miles to do the soundtrack for the film, but initially, Miles didn't really want to because he didn't have his normal band with him. But after seeing the film a couple of times and discussing where music would probably be needed, they took advantage of the one night that Miles had off from playing at the club while he was in Paris. They rented a studio and they hired some musicians for the session. One actually happened to be the drummer Kenny Clark, but the other three were just French studio musicians. They started at 10 at night and they didn't finish until 5 o'clock the next morning. That kind of sounds like a super late night, but when you actually think about it, that's 7 hours of recording time. That's like one solid day in the studio. That's really not a lot of time. And what they did is they just put the parts on loop of the movie that they needed to record music to, and they just kept going around and around and around and improvised the whole thing. And they managed to get this score done in one night. And the score, as well as its effect on the film, they were considered groundbreaking at the time. Let's listen to another bit. Okay, This is sort of where I'm going with this video, and the point is to say it might sound so insane and so crazy that a movie score could be improvised in one night. But there are a lot of things about improvisation and about the way just jazz kind of works that allows this type of thing to be absolutely possible. And this is the first example that I'm seeing of something that's like, okay, there we go. This tune that they're playing right now is Sweet George Brown. That's really slowed down, but listen very closely to the bass. That. It's the whole tune. Literally the whole tune is George Brown. Like, watch this. So this illustrates some interesting things about improvisation, especially in the context of jazz. Thankfully, you can't copyright a chord progression. With all the stupid and insane and, quite frankly, really dangerous lawsuits that have been thrown around in recent times, one of the things that has always kind of been true that people understand is that we have what's called contrafacts. In jazz, a contrafact is a tune that's just written on the changes of another tune, but it isn't that tune. It doesn't use the melody. Because it doesn't use the melody, that's totally okay. Contrafacts were one of the most widely used things throughout the era of bebop, when jazz musicians would just write improvised lines over a classic chord progression and create their own tunes. In fact, some of the most famous tunes that we know of in bebop are literally contrafacts of something else. When we talk about rhythm changes, that is literally just saying, okay, we're gonna play a song that's on the changes to I Got Rhythm by George Gershwin. But how many tunes have been written on rhythm changes? Tons. I mean, the blues, a 12-bar blues is exactly the same thing. It's just a form that gets used time and time again to write all kinds of different tunes. So what Miles is doing here is he's using Sweet George Brown, the tune, as the basis for the harmonic structure, and everything else he's doing on top of it is just improvised. Because of that, it avoids any issues that could potentially arise with copyright. You can take the chord changes from some of your favorite songs and you can just write new melodies to them. And that's one of the devices that they're clearly using here. And my guess is the go-to in Miles's head was probably like, oh, you know what? The changes to Sweet George Brown probably work really well here. And we can just like play it super fast and I'll just play over it. And there we go. We get what we need. We need to save time. We need something high energy. Why are we going to make this from scratch? Let's just basically build our own contrafact. I'm not really sure what's going on here at all. I just listened through like 3/4 of this tune trying to hear the bass, like where the bass line is going. And it's got me wondering if this specific track is more of a thing where they're like, let's just play in B flat, because I keep hearing this, you know, general home bass in B flat, but it doesn't feel like it's definitively going anywhere. Maybe Miles just was like, okay, let's just play this tempo in B flat, listen and react. There are times when Miles is playing sort of harmonic centers that don't seem to really match what the bass is doing. Sweet Georgia Brown, that stuck out to me immediately. This does not. And that's why I'm kind of wondering like if it's the type of thing that's much more pure improvisation. And if that's not what this is still a relevant point, because what I wanted to talk about a little bit is how this improvisation thing works. If that is indeed what they're doing here, how does that work? How does the drummer, the bass player, and Miles all understand understand what to do. And the answer is kind of simple, really. Everyone can play. Everyone can, can do what is necessary at the level that's required. So when Miles says something like, all right, we're just gonna play at this tempo in B flat, you just start going, and then everybody's just listening very intently, listening and reacting. It's like, okay, B flat, bass player says, well, I'm gonna outline some things, almost like I'm playing a blues or something like that, but just not changing the chord. And outside of that, I mean, Miles is free to just sort of listen and float on top and try different harmonic devices. And of course, without a chord instrument, it's maybe a little more difficult to hear exactly what's going on. Bass notes are sometimes harder to hear for people that aren't used to listening to those types of frequencies. It sounds insane. Miles walked into the studio at 10 p.m. and by 5 a.m. he walked out and they had improvised an entire film score. I just went on Professional Musicians React with Jack Conte and Ryan Lerman. If you haven't checked out that episode, I'll link it in the description. It was super fun. But one of the things we talked about is that John Williams wrote Jurassic Park in like a month, like the entire film score in a month. But this was done in a night, in 7 hours. So it begs the question, like, how does that happen? How do people do that? And it's certainly not to take away from the insane accomplishment of getting an entire movie score done in the one night off you have on a gig trip to Paris. But if anything, I want you guys to understand that like this stuff is attainable. Now, to be at a level where you can play like Miles or Kenny Clark, that obviously takes a lifetime of practice. But the principles of improvisation are very applicable here. Hey, it's the next day because my literal entire thing just died. But here's my point with all this. It's the execution that people sometimes don't realize is far more accessible than you might think. It might take you a while to practice and work up the ability to play things that are much more intricate, especially some of the faster stuff that we've seen here in this film. But with even a pretty basic understanding of how chords work, you can come up with some really cool things. For example, the first piece that we looked at, that sort of James Bond sounding thing, you can do this thing where you get together with a group and you say, okay, well, why don't we go let's start on A minor, and then we go up to B flat major, and then from there we'll go down to G minor 7. Oh yeah, maybe D minor 9 after that. We can just take those 4 chords and just sort of work with that a little bit. I could literally just give that information to a band and just say, okay, 1, 2, 3, oh. And with an entire band, I can sit there and we can just play around with that for a while. Then maybe at some point somebody introduces a new idea and everybody goes, oh yeah, let's do that. Simply by just listening and hearing what everyone around you is doing, you can create some really cool things just right on the spot. What's interesting about this film and the way that the score was done is like, you can do this with your friends, you can do this with a band, you can do this on your own, just by giving yourself a wider set of parameters and saying, okay, well, why don't I go from this chord to this chord to this chord? Just mess around with it. There's always this interesting thought process with improvisation, because so many people look at it as kind of like some sort of mystical foreign language. How do you possibly make things up on the spot? The reality is it takes practice, which is weird, right? Because we're making it up on the spot. So how are we practicing ahead of time what we need to come up with on our own? But the fact of the matter is, it's just like anything else. Even though it is made up on the spot, the more you do it, the better you will get at it. And you will start to learn things like how to apply different music theory concepts to your playing so that you can make more informed and more specific and more purposeful decisions. If you've ever wanted to dive deeper on this and actually get started learning how to improvise, we've built an entire course all about this over on the Cornell Music Academy. And by the way, everything on the Academy is currently 30% off using the code MUSICTHEORY30 at checkout. So now is a fantastic time to get a hold of that Intro to Improvisation course. It'll guide you through all of the steps of how to start approaching improvisation. If you've never tried it before, we will get you improvising for the first time in a very clear and concise way that gives you plenty of space to mess around. There are tons of exercise and actionable steps and examples, including backing tracks, so that you guys can work on putting this stuff into practice. I still explicitly remember what it felt like to improvise for the first time, letting yourself play things that you just don't know what you're doing, and you're afraid to sound bad, and you're afraid to just kind of start doing it because you don't want to sound like an idiot. You don't know what you're doing. But sometimes it just takes a little push to break through that barrier, and that's that's exactly what the course is designed to do. If you're not there yet and you're still working on wanting to learn how to play the piano to begin with, we have a huge course that is all about just an intro to this instrument and learning how to start playing it today. You don't need any experience, you don't need any background in music. We will guide you through everything you need to know to start understanding things about how to actually play the instrument, as well as different things about reading music and understanding what notation looks like and what it means. It's over 170 videos of instruction and tons of actionable exercises and steps that you can take to start learning how to play this instrument today. Once again, everything over there is 30% off right now with the code MUSICTHEORY30. Be sure to check it out and see if there's something there that's right for you, so that you can learn how to go and improvise an entire movie score in a 7-hour recording session overnight. Okay, maybe that'll take a little more time and practice, but you can get there. Let me know in the comments below, did you guys know that this movie even existed? I was not aware of this. It was a full year before Kind of Blue came out in 1959. And of course, we all know that as the record that kind of blew Miles' career into the stratosphere. I had no idea that he even did this. So this was really cool to find out about and check out some of the music from. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate your time, and we will see you in the next video.